Thank you. Thank you, Anita, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming to church on a Sunday evening. I feel I should be conducting a mass, but I'm Hindu. As Anita mentioned, I've been working on a book-length essay about cities. I was born in Calcutta and grew up in Bombay and Jackson Heights in Queens, which we now call Jacobson Heights, because it's the little India of New York. So I've lived in cities all my life, and I've written a book about one very large city, Bombay, and am now embarked on another Sisyphean endeavor to write a book about New York. I went to the Iowa Writers' Workshop many years ago, and we would come to Chicago to actually come to a real city. It's when I went from New York to Iowa City that I realized it wasn't a city at all. So I was desperate to get that kind of city fix, which only Chicago could offer me. And I remember we'd go out with a bunch of our friends and take the bus 4 hours to Chicago and Hyde Park and eat Ethiopian food and listen to blues and possibly get mugged. And we really needed that experience. I'm very happy to be here again. And now my son, who might be in the audience if he's made his train, is now at the University of Chicago. So I've been spending some time in Hyde Park this trip. So I'll read a bit from my new book, which is tentatively titled The Secret Life of Cities. And then we'll open it up for discussion. Okay. What is the story of a city? What is the story of Mumbai, of New York, of Sao Paulo? It depends on who's telling it and who's listening. There is the statistical city, and there is the impressionistic city. The perception that each individual, tourist or resident, has of a particular city. When the individual's impression is challenged by statistical evidence, he's often shocked. But that doesn't make his impressions any less compelling. Tourists walking around New York think it's a multi-ethnic paradise, the races strolling along the avenues in a gorgeous mosaic. The statistical truth, however, is that New York is the second most segregated city in America, right after Detroit. Each city has two types of narratives, the official story and the unofficial story. The official story has buzz and flash about it. The unofficial story is quieter, but it is the one that is more likely to endure. The unofficial story is largely orally transmitted. You can listen to it in the phone centers, in the immigrant quarters of our cities, in the CDs and telenovelas that migrants send back to their families, in the popular ballads and folk songs of Bollywood films. It is the news of the city that migrants carry back to the village. Most of the time, these stories are inaccessible to outsiders, partly for reasons of language, and partly because the technology is so primitive. In Mumbai, for example, there's a community of professional scribes, of letter writers, who sit opposite the General Post Office, who help illiterate migrants craft letters back to their relatives in the village.
Could you boost your microphone a little bit?
Oh, okay. Is this better? Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Many of their customers are prostitutes. The scribes helped them craft fictions about their lives in the city to send back to their worried parents. They create personas of maids, secretaries, call center workers. And the letter writers also create another kind of fiction for the prostitutes. They write letters on their behalf to the prostitutes' clients, love letters telling them how much they miss them, how they need money for the child, money not to lie with other men. The letter writers are also story sellers. I ran into another such group of letter writers in Mexico City, sitting in the shade of an arcade in the shabby downtown. One of them was typing on an IBM Selectric, some kind of commercial correspondence. There used to be 8 or 9 letter writers there who specialized in love letters. But now there are only just a couple left. Times are tough for them, said the commercial letter writer. Why? I asked. Is the internet killing off their business? No, he answered. It's because nobody is falling in love anymore. These letters are nowhere recorded in historians' archives, but they should be. When the villager moves to the city, the first thing he sends back home is not money, it is a story. These unofficial migrant stories are essential to maintaining a kind of continuity for people on the move. For most of our history as a species, we have not been attuned to radical, continuous movement. We have stayed in one place, in our villages. But in the past quarter of a century, the world's migrant population has doubled. Today, 250 million people live in a country different from the one they were born in, or 1 out of every 28 humans. If all the migrants were a nation by themselves, they would constitute the 5th largest country in the world. And of these 250 million people, today there are 60 million people who have been displaced by war or climate change. And there's going to be many more in the decades ahead. I think it's going to be the defining issue of this century, mass migration. My own family has moved all over the earth, from India to Kenya to England to the USA and back again, and it is still moving. One of my grandfathers left rural Gujarat for Calcutta in the salad days of the 20th century. My other grandfather, living half a day's bullock cart ride away, left soon after for Nairobi. In Calcutta, my paternal grandfather joined his older brother in the jewelry business. In Nairobi, my maternal grandfather began his career at 16, sweeping the floors of his uncle's accounting office. Thus began my family's journey from village to the city. It was, I now realize, less than 100 years ago. When I go back to the village of Mauda, where my father's people are from, I find a house with durable Burma teak cabinets, a well by the mango tree in the courtyard, and a sense of peace behind high walls. But the village has become a town. Mauda now has some 16,000 residents, its own Facebook page, and an organization which brings together people hailing from the town, mostly Patels, who my family would look down upon. In New Jersey, there is an invitation on the Mauda Facebook page. Mauda Gam Summer Picnic 2012. We will be grilling and chilling at this annual Mauda Gam Summer Picnic. So come join us with your family to enjoy this fun time. The venue, Roosevelt Park, Grove 2A and 2B, Edison, New Jersey. In the first few years after we got to the country America, my family would send us airmail letters from India, flimsy trifold pieces of paper on which every centimeter was covered with writing. Urgent, necessary news. Nirufoi's son got married. Asha Bana's heart problem. The price of onions has shot up to 10 rupees a kilo and times are hard. When we could afford it, once in a very great while, we would call. My father still raises his voice on long-distance calls from his home in New Jersey to mine in Manhattan. As late as the 1990s, calling abroad from India, or even between Indian cities, necessitated the booking of a call with the state telephone monopoly. You could book a regular call, or an express, or a lightning call. The rates increased with the urgency of your purpose. You would be given a booking number, And you waited all day, and then the phone rang, and the operator would affirm your identity and the caller's identity, and you would be connected for 3 minutes. After 3 minutes, the operator intervened in your discussion of love or business and asked, "Continue? Continue, continue," my father would yell, and get another 3 minutes. In its pursuit of happiness, sometimes greedy, sometimes altruistic, my own family has moved all over the world, from the villages to the cities. How do we maintain any kind of continuity? Like all migrants, our consolation through this relentless movement consists in storytelling, recollection, recollection as an antidote to dislocation. In New York, my American-born children sit with my mother as she tells them stories her father told her about traveling through the East African bush, selling textiles and whiskey for a Scottish trading company. And with my father, as he tells them about his father buying the estates of dissipated Maharajas in Calcutta for his jewelry business. With these story fibers, we darn patches over the holes of the ragged quilt of time, and we continue. In Italo Calvino's Invisible City, from his great book Invisible Cities, in the invisible city of Euphemia, the merchants of 7 nations gather at every solstice and equinox to trade in the bazaars. But more importantly, after the trading is done, as they lie on their empty sacks and barrels, they trade stories. For each word that one of them says, sister, battle, lovers, elicits a story from the others. I will tell my stories today. I will start them not with a word, but with a statistic, the most important statistic of our age. For the first time in history, more human beings live in cities than in villages. We have become an urban species. 10% of us lived in cities in 1900, 53% in 2010. By 2050, 75% of us will be living in cities when there will be 9 billion of us on the planet. In 1970, the world only had 2 megacities, or cities of more than 10 million, New York and Tokyo. Today, there are 23. By 2025, there will be at least 37. Most of them will be in the developing world, what we used to call the third world. More than half of all Chinese, 712 million people, still live in rural areas, but they're moving out of the farms. By next year, there will be as many Chinese in cities as in villages. By 2035, 70% of the country will be city dwellers. As they move to the cities, the Chinese are experiencing a surge of nostalgia for the village, but not necessarily the village they came from. The Chinese like Europe, especially old Europe, especially old European villages. A Chinese mining tycoon liked the quaint 2nd century BC Austrian village of Hallstatt so much that he decided to commission, at a cost of $940 million, an exact replica of the village near Huizhou in the Pearl River Delta. It has replicas of the village's clock tower, wooden houses, and cobblestone streets, all for sale to investors. In 1997, UNESCO decided that Hallstatt should be a World Heritage Site. The Chinese decided to build a knockoff. At first, the Austrians were pissed. There were noises made about imitation without royalties. But the taste of the facsimile village has created a thirst for the real thing. There used to be a scant 50 Chinese tourists a year to the original lakeside Austrian village. There are now thousands. And the Austrians are pleased to be emulated by a rising superpower. The tycoon's company, Min Metals, is now working on a recreation of Scotland in southeast China, near Hunan. What kind of Scotland will it be? Not the Scotland of the dismal council estates of Glasgow, surely. It will be a Scotland of haggis slinging, whiskey drinking, bagpipe playing, kilt wearing men who all look like Mel Gibson. In other words, brand Scotland. So, in another section of the book, I talk about migration and storytelling, and I become fascinated with the ways that when we move to countries, we tell a story about the places that we go to the people left behind. So and that story is half truth, half lie. So I'm now going to talk about lying and migration. One way that the poor get around the rigor of the law is through subterfuge or embellishment. I like gossip and I like lies. Gossip because it helps you see the person whole, and lying because it is an elevated form of storytelling, and storytelling puts the people back into cities. This is what novelists traffic in, after all, gossip and lies. Tolstoy, Flaubert, Garcia Marquez, gossip mongers all. Did you hear about that scandalous Anna Kay? Threw herself in front of a train, yes, because she thought her boyfriend was going to dump her. Where does the truth lie? I grew up in the India of the 1970s, where buying a car was no simple thing. You had to register for a car for years, and when the lucky day came, you felt blessed, literally. I remember when my family in Bombay got lucky enough to be allotted a small Fiat, the first thing we did was to take it to the temple and perform a car puja. We put vermilion on it, waved lamps around it, and broke a coconut on its hood. And then we took pictures of it and sent it back to my grandparents in Calcutta to prove that we were well set in Bombay. It was important that we had documentary evidence of our success. All migrants, having forsaken family and friends in order to move, then face a mighty task, convincing the family and friends in the homeland that it was worth it. The standards are high, the tests stern. I have a young Bangladeshi friend in New York whose parents have a Mercedes-Benz parked in the driveway of their small, simple home in a working-class neighborhood of Queens. All those who come to their home must first walk around the Benz. They bought it with the first savings they made in America, $7,000. What kind of Mercedes can you buy with $7,000? I asked my friend. Does it run? It runs all right. So what's the catch? What's wrong with it? Well, the wipers stopped working a while ago, and we can't afford to buy new wipers. They're $200 each. So what do you do when it rains? Before we drive anywhere, we always check the weather forecast, my friends. And if it rains while you're driving, we always keep a subway map in the glove compartment. If it starts raining, we park it and get into the nearest subway and come back for it after it stops raining. So the Benz is practically useless for the family, but it serves a higher function. It communicates to the people back in Dhaka that the family is well set. And sending back pictures or videos of the family standing around the Benz is not subterfuge, not exactly. Yes, it's true that my friend's parents have retired and his sister have recently lost a job in a food magazine, and my friend will have to turn over half of his paycheck to help his parents meet the mortgage. So the image symbolized by the Benz may not reflect the true reality of the precarious situation, but for them, it is a necessary deception. These stories can afflict the people who have to listen to them back home in all kinds of ways. A man I met once in Delhi told me about his cousins in Kentucky. Every summer in his childhood, the cousins would visit his family in Delhi, and the family would drop everything to host their American relatives, taking them here and there, preparing their choicest meals, sleeping in the living room so that the visitors could rest undisturbed in the bedrooms. The cousins regularly sent over photos of themselves in front of their bungalow, which means villa in the Indian context, not a one-floor cottage as it does in America. Photos of themselves with their arms around their large new television or lying on the hood of their large new car. When the man from Delhi grew up, he got a chance to visit his cousins in Kentucky for the first time. He expected them to live like millionaires. When he finally got to their fabled home in Kentucky, he started screaming obscenities. He saw their bungalow, which was actually the shabbiest house on the block, their ordinary car, and saw that they lived at a much lower standard than his own family in Delhi, who had been made to feel impoverished every time his cousins visited. All his childhood, he had felt deprived because of this lie. He howled out his abuse at the Kentucky liars. But it's not just people. Governments also, in this age of mass migration, put out another kind of lie, an official one, the reverse of propaganda, a guide to the city, which really is meant as a caution against moving to the city. The government of the Netherlands recently tried to make itself unattractive to potential Muslim and African migrants by creating a film called To the Netherlands, consisting of gay couples kissing, topless women sunbathing. The film is compulsory viewing for prospective immigrants who have to buy a copy costing hundreds of dollars, except for those making more than $54,000 a year, or citizens of rich countries like the US, for whom the requirement is waived. The film also shows the crime-ridden ghettos where immigrants might end up living. There are interviews with immigrants who call the Dutch cold and distant. The film warns of traffic jams, problems finding a job, and flooding in the low-lying country. My friend, the Pakistani writer Mohsin Hamid, one of the residents of the Muslim countries that the Dutch government is so desperately trying to keep out, suggests another track the Dutch could take. They could produce a film extolling Belgium. Wonderful, wonderful Belgium, the film could say. The almost Holland, but closer. In 2011, the city of Gatineau in Quebec published a, quote, statement of values for new immigrants, which cautions against, quote, strong odors emanating from cooking, which might offend Canadians. It also informs migrants that in Canada, it is not okay to bribe city officials. Also, that it is best to show up punctually for appointments. It followed a guide published by another Quebec town, Hérouville, which warned immigrants that stoning someone to death in public was expressly forbidden. The warning was duly noted by the town's sole immigrant family, which refrained from stoning its women in public. The rich countries complain loudly about migration from the poor ones. This is how the game was rigged. First, you colonized us and stole our treasure and prevented us from building our industries. Then you brought us over to work as, quote, guest workers, as if you knew what the word guest means in our cultures, but forbade us from bringing our spouses and children. Then, having built up your economies with our raw material and our labor, having had your pleasure with us, you asked us to go back and were surprised when we did not. You stole our minerals and corrupted our governments, and were aghast when the poorest among us made our way beyond your borders, not to steal, but to work, to clean your toilets and lie with your men. Still you needed us. You needed us to operate your computers and heal your sick and teach your kids. So you took our best and brightest, those who had been educated at the greatest expense of the struggling states they came from, and seduced them again to work for you. This is how the game is now rigged. But you can no more keep people from moving across man-made borders than you can birds or clouds. People will keep coming to cities because it's where you go to better yourself. I met a young Russian girl at a party in Soho. She had come out for the evening from her parents' small apartment in Brighton Beach, traveling an hour by subway. In cities like New York, you're always trying to find something better, she said. a better apartment, a better job, a better lover. And this is what distinguishes a great city from one that's not. In a great city, you never quite find the best, but you know it exists just out of your reach, and so you keep striving. If you're satisfied with your lot, there is no reason for you to stay in the city. You will become a drain on its energy. Keep climbing or fall behind. Staying in place is not an option. What the Russian girl left unsaid is that when you seek to do better, you have to dump the one you're with, the worst partner, apartment, job. But during the search, you can cheat, you can look, you can dream. Human beings, as a species, like to live in colonies, not caves. We have turned away from Thoreau and Tolstoy and Gandhi. Given a choice, we'll take buildings, crowds, paved streets over open spaces, solitude, trees. A gangster in Bombay, originally from a village in the north, defined the attraction of the city for him. Quote, all facilities available 24 hours. So, the attraction of the city is the attraction of flexible time. You eat when you want, you go dancing when you want. You can work after the sun sets and sleep through the harvest time. Neither sun nor moon nor God can tell you when to sleep, eat, work. Somewhere in the great city, someone has a shop open which will sell you what you want right this very minute. But if we move to cities to expand time, we also find that what contracts is space. All over the world, there's a giant renunciation of personal space. The attractions of the big house with its lawns and swimming pool belong to the last century. People are choosing to go home from work to sleep in tiny spaces, like peasants in medieval towns choosing to come behind the walls of the fort after nightfall. Except this time, it's not because they might be prey to marauding bandits that the country is unsafe. Now they come to the cities because the countryside is boring, the city is exciting. People are giving up personal space in their apartments, in transport, in shopping, in amusement. They are rediscovering the pleasures of the flesh, of tactile contact in the street, of throngs on the 4th of July, watching the fireworks, of sidewalk tables where you have to wait an hour for a table for the privilege of eating your meal while watching many other people. A crowded bar can charge more than a bar where you can have a conversation and be heard. For a long time, urban planners thought that density was a bad thing, that in order for human beings to live a good life, they needed to go to the suburbs and find their own quarter-acre Eden, and that then they'd commute to their workplaces by automobile. But the world is decisively turning its back on suburbanization, and we're recognizing that people don't mind being clustered in these giant buildings, rubbing shoulders with lots of people on the sidewalks. Cities are actually the purest expression of who we are as human beings, the best and the worst parts of us. This is our great mark on the planet, these cities that you can see from outer space. It's sometimes incomprehensible. Take Port-au-Prince, the Haitian capital. The 2010 earthquake killed 250,000 people there. And a lot of them died because they shouldn't all be living there in shacks on the shifting hillsides. The earthquake was a disaster, easily foretold. But you know what? There are actually more people living in Port-au-Prince now than before the earthquake. They're still coming into the city, which is growing at 3.5% per year. So in a sense, it doesn't matter how bad a city is. I think even Detroit is going to come back. It's going through a downturn right now, but in 10 years, there'll be more people living in Detroit. Because there's something about cities, no matter how awful they are, which speaks to something in us as human beings. This need to live in clusters, this metropolitan excitement, this sense that you won't starve in the cities as you might in the countryside. Whether they're working cities like New York or dysfunctional cities like Kinshasa, this is where the action is. I'm going to stop here and take some questions, and then I'll read a section from my Bombay book. But I have plenty more to say about cities. In a later section of the book, I talk about my 3 principles for a non-exclusive city. So one of the things I became concerned with as I was in New York is what makes for a just city? What makes for a good city? And I think the biggest problem confronting American cities today is inequality. The fact that the top 1% of New Yorkers earns more in one day than the bottom 44% earn in a year. So the answer occurred to me while sitting on the boardwalk in Coney Island. If you sit, some of you here must have been to Coney Island. It's the capital of fun. It's also known as the people's playground because anyone can afford to go there. So if you sit on the boardwalk in Coney Island, you notice the whole parade of humanity walking by, the Bangladeshis in hijab, next to the Russians in the bikinis, next to the anarchists in leather, next to the hipsters from the East Village. They're all walking on the boardwalk, and then they all go to their little clusters on the beach. Now the thing is, it's not like they hang out with each other, the Bangladeshis and the anarchists. It's not that everyone is included, it's that no one is excluded. So it's not that you'll be invited to every picnic on the beach, but it's that somewhere on the beach there's a picnic you can go to. So this for me is what makes for a great city. It's not that you can go to any party in the city, but somewhere in the city there's a party that you can go to. So I thought of 3 things that cities need to do in order to be non-exclusive cities. And the first is don't exclude anyone from the law. The second is don't exclude anyone from the conversation. And the third is don't exclude anyone from the celebration. So by that I mean the law is structured today in a way which excludes the poor, particularly in housing. It doesn't matter how great Chicago is, how many cafes or bars you can go to, how terrific the transportation system is, if you can't afford to live there. And cities today are pushing out the poor, the immigrants, marginal in unprecedented ways. So New York, for example, 1 out of 5 people on the island of Manhattan is a tourist. And the question I have as I go around doing my New York book is, what happened to the good people who stayed through the bad times? So in the 1970s, New York was a basket case. It was on the verge of bankruptcy. And I came to New York in 1977. I've been mugged regularly in Queens. What happened to the people who endured all those decades of crack, bankruptcy, blackouts? Where did they go? So as New York becomes, this capital of the world, the storied city in the movies, in the television series, 15% of its African American population has left in the last decade. And where are they going? Back to the South, where their ancestors came from, where after Restoration they moved up to the cities. So they're going back to the Carolinas, to Atlanta, because they can afford to get a house there, as they can't in New York. So the second principle is don't exclude anyone from the conversation. And the conversation about cities, so urban planning, it's become like the Latin Mass in churches like this. If you listen to urbanists talking to each other, you'd get the impression it's buildings talking to buildings, that there's no human beings involved. But as Shakespeare points out in Coriolanus, what is the city but the people? So, I've gone to planning academies at MIT, at Harvard, where there are brilliant planners working, and I tell them it's critical for the urban planner also to be a public intellectual, to go out and talk about what planning means for the people who have to live in them. The problem is that the real estate developers can afford to hire these planners, and public relations firms which spin a kind of story of the city, of the condominiums that they're selling. But the people who actually, the thing about urban planning is that when you have jargon in something like literary theory, it's kind of marginal to most people because it's not going to affect the quality of our day-to-day lives. But for urban planners, your dreams can become our nightmares because we have to live in them. So it's very important for planners to go out because they've studied their Jane Jacobs, they know what works in cities and what doesn't. And so I think it's essential for planners to tell people in Bombay, for example, where the only large public project in the last several decades has been a giant bridge across the harbor which is closed to pedestrians. It's only for cars paying 50 rupees to go over the bridge. So as you enter the bridge, there's a big sign of a bullock cart with a cross over it. No bullock carts on the bridge, but cars are okay. And you know what this bridge does? It gets you to your traffic jam faster. So the answer to traffic congestion isn't building more roads and bridges, it's public transport. This is a lesson which cities all over the world are learning, but in Bombay, it's as if it's starting from first principles. Because the bridge has a story behind it. It is official story, spun by the consultants, the developers, the government. And the third principle is don't exclude anyone from the celebration. So cities, as I mentioned, it's an incredibly exciting place to live today, the modern city. And as I say, it is the purest expression of who we are. But with the kind of inequality that we're seeing in cities all around the world, we are excluding enormous numbers of people who are already living in the city from the celebration. There's a great book by Thomas Piketty called Capital, which analyzes in detail the ways in which wealth has gotten concentrated at the top. Today, the 80 richest people on the planet own more than the bottom half of all human beings combined. This is an extraordinary statistic, that 80 people own more than 3 billion people around the planet combined. And this is the long-term danger for the cities that we live in, that they become these islands of the rich, which are emptied out of people. And it becomes an impoverished city, not just for the poor, but also for the rich. The Upper East Side of New York is a boring place because when you come out of your luxury condominium, there's very few people on the street, and you don't interact with other people, which is the biggest thing that makes cities great. Some 30% of all the buildings on the Upper East Side are empty 10 or more months of the year because they're owned by overseas Russians, Indians, Chinese, who buy these apartments as investment vehicles and keep them empty. This is the death of a city. So there can be something as too much money coming into the city for its own good, which I think is happening to many of these global cities today. Anyway, I'm happy to take questions now. I think there are microphones here, so.
I enjoyed reading Maximum City about 10 years ago and wonder how Bombay has changed.
So, if you want to hear this answer in about 900 words, the current issue of India Today, which is the India's largest news magazine, it's got a cover called Minimum City, in which I have an essay in which I talk about how Bombay, Mumbai has changed. So it's become a much more unpleasant place to live. First of all, it's the air pollution in Indian cities, and in Bombay and Delhi in particular, it's so great that it makes Beijing look like Darjeeling. It's much worse than the Chinese cities. And air pollution is something that affects rich and poor alike. It's also going through one of its periodic spasms of violence, led by the Shiv Sena, which is the political party that's in power in the city and in the state, Maharashtra, that Bombay is the capital of. So they've recently forced the cancellation of a concert by the great Ghulam Ali, who's a Pakistani singer, who came to Bombay in tribute to another ghazal singer, Jagjit Singh, who was his friend. Writers are getting beaten up. Muslims are getting attacked. There's a ban on, eating beef, which makes no sense in a cosmopolitan city like Bombay. So it's going through one of these periodic attacks on the cosmopolitan nature of Bombay, which is really what makes the city great. And it also really has no plan for the future. So this is another thing which is, cities these days are anxious to brand themselves. And Bombay, a few years ago, wanted to brand itself. So it asked the management consulting firm McKinsey, a firm of professional storytellers, to help it with branding the city. So McKinsey came out with a document called Vision Mumbai, in which it said, it laid out these ways in which Mumbai could be, quote, a world-class city like Shanghai by 2020. As the architect Charles Correa pointed out, that's not a vision, that's a hallucination. The biggest issue with Bombay today, politically speaking, is that it has no autonomy from the state of Maharashtra. And all over the world, cities need to be in control of their own destiny. New York can't pass traffic congestion laws without getting permission from Albany. In Bombay, the mayor is only a figurehead. So the destiny of the city is controlled by people from the rural areas who don't have a metropolitan sensibility or any kind of allegiance to the people of Bombay. They see Bombay as this golden goose to be looted at will. And so the city is a mess. But for me, it'll always be a glorious mess, because when I go there, I've got this tremendous emotional attachment to it. And, in spite of what a terrible mess it's become, there's still 1 million people a year who come to what is now Greater Bombay. So New York will add 1 million people in the next 20 years. Bombay gets 1 million people every year. So all these people, they're voting with their feet. They must know something.
Hi, Mr. Mehta. I'm not from Bombay. I'm from the other side of India. My city is also going through like that. I'm from Guwahati. It's a very small, compared to Bombay, it's a small city. You have exclusively written about Bombay as well as from New York, about New York. If you ever write a book like Tale of Two Cities, how would you connect the dots between New York and Bombay?
So in what ways New York and Bombay are similar? Yes. I think they are quite similar in, well, first of all, they have a commercial imperative. So in Bombay, we call it dhanda. In New York, we call it the hustle. And they're above all great entrepreneurial cities. So I'll give you one story of why I'll always love Bombay. So when I wrote Maximum City, I wanted it to be adopted by Bombay most of all. I wanted it, I had no idea what I was doing. It was my first book, and I had no, because I'm considered an NRI, I had been away from Bombay for 21 years. When I went back, I didn't know how it would do. But I knew the city really liked my book and took it for its own. In fact, the unofficial moniker for Bombay now is Maximum City. That's its brand, not Vision Mumbai. I found my book appearing in pirated editions all over the city. So if you go to Bombay now, there's like all these stacks of books, and I'm not getting a paisa in royalties. So I was sitting in a taxi at a red light, and this kid comes to me, with a pile of books, and on top is mine. Maximum City, and I said, tell me about this book. I said, sir, all Bombay is in this book. I said, good, how much is it? I said, 500 rupees. I said, 500? You know, I've written this book. I said, fine, if you've written it, you can have it for 400. That kid was, so quick on the uptake. I told my publisher to fire all their sales staff and hire kids like these because they bring the bookshop to the customer. And, and this kid was a street urchin. I didn't feel bad that he was selling me this pirated edition because I've set up a fund for children in India called the Maximum Child Trust, and all my Indian royalties are going to this fund. But these two cities, in New York also, I found similar examples of this hustle, this entrepreneurial drive. They're both port cities, and they're both marked by an openness to migration. In Bombay's case, from the rest of India and also Bangladesh, and in New York, from all over the planet. 2 out of 3 New Yorkers are immigrants or their children. So I moved at the age of 14 from Bombay to New York, and I've been going back and forth like a ping pong ball between these two cities all my life. My 2 children were born in Manhattan, and for this book that I'm writing, the New York book, is my gift to them, my explanation of their hometown. But they're the 2 cities of my heart. I've also lived in Brazilian cities, I've lived in Paris, I've lived in London. I like all these other cities. But God help me, I am not going to write another book about a city. It just takes too damn long. It took 7 years for my last book. It's taking even longer for the New York book. It is an exhausting but passionate endeavor.
We have another question back here.
So my parents are from a village in Gujarat, and I've been there before, and I've noticed that there are so many Muslims in that Gujarat side of India. So
Yes.
I was wondering, what's your perspective towards Muslims overall in India and Bombay?
Right. So the proportion of Muslims in Bombay is higher than the country as a whole. So some 13% of Indians are Muslim, and in Bombay, the numbers are close to 20%. I've also been to Ahmedabad. My family is originally from Ahmedabad. And of course, our current Prime Minister was the Chief Minister of Gujarat. And in 2002, there was a notorious pogrom against Muslims, which made me ashamed to be Gujarati. Just before the last election, where Modi was re-elected as Chief Minister, I went to Gujarat and I walked around Ahmedabad. And I went to this Muslim sort of ghetto in Ahmedabad. And these people, they weren't really affected in the last 2002 riots because the rioting happened more in the border areas, not where the Muslims had concentrated. So after the riots, the Muslims went into these ghetto areas, and there's now a concentration of the Hindus and the Muslims in Ahmedabad. They got very few services from the state. And one thing I noticed that a certain section of Indian Muslims had become radicalized, that they would say Allah Hafiz instead of Khuda Hafiz. The names of the buildings in the Muslim ghetto were Arabic rather than Urdu. And they were speaking less and less Gujarati and more Arabic. So there is, among South Asian Muslims, I know this is true in Pakistan too, Islam in South Asia as a whole, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, it's got this very long history, and this history of coexistence. It's one place where the Muslims came to that part of the world, and most of the people, 80% in India, still stayed Hindu. And some of the greatest achievements of Hindu philosophy and art happened during Mughal times. It's also true that the Muslims came and destroyed temples, there was friction, there was this long history. But it's significant that there really is no ISIS or Al-Qaeda in India. India, until recently, had more Muslims than Pakistan. It was the 4th largest Muslim nation in the world. Right now, it's the 5th largest Muslim nation in the world. And there are periodic attacks upon Muslims. There are riots, which I've detailed at length in my book. But for the most part, the compact has hold because I think even the Muslims in India believe in the idea of India. And this idea is very complex in interesting ways. And I'll tell you just one story that illustrates what I'm talking about, the ways in which anything you can say about India is true and false simultaneously. So I was once doing a story for Harper's Magazine in the city of Varanasi, Benares, in the north, which is the holiest city in Hinduism, but also has a significant population of Muslims. Benares is known for its sari industry. Muslims weave them, Hindus sell them. And I went there in '91 when there was a month-long curfew because of Hindu-Muslim rioting, the worst in the city's history. And I knew that there was a local BJP leader who had fomented the riots, and he was a sari merchant. So I went to interview him, and he asked me to meet him at his house one Sunday morning. So I go there with my laptop, and as I enter his house, I see 2 old Muslim men sitting on the veranda, on the balcony. They're talking among themselves. I sit with the sari merchant, and he tells me all this, spews hate against Muslims. They should have gone to Pakistan at partition. They always cheer for Pakistan at cricket matches. Why are they here? So, completely useless interview. I'd heard all this many times before. So as I was shutting down my laptop, I said, by the way, what are these 2 Muslim men doing on your veranda? I said, oh, they've come to settle a property dispute. I said, what's your dispute? He said, no, not with me, between themselves. I said, why you? I thought you hate Muslims. He said, yes, but I hate them all equally. So if they go to settle this property dispute with a leader in their own community, he might be biased towards one or the other, related to one or the other. But since they know I hate them all equally, they can speak to me about the property dispute and be convinced that I can give them a fair and equitable judgment in the matter of the property dispute. This is why India drives foreign journalists mad, because we can hold more than one proposition in our mind at the same time. The Western system of logic, the Aristotelian law of the excluded middle, something can be either true or false. In the system of logic among the Jains, for example, the Jain religion, their system of philosophical logic is called Shyadvada, the science of maybiness, which have no fewer than 7 possible states of being. So something can be true, false, both, neither, etc.
That actually concludes our program for tonight. We will do a book purchasing, and the book signing are going to be right behind us in the Mabuhay room.